by Carrie McDonald and Teresa Cooley, and they're called Love is Hard. Love is hard. Love for people, especially those who are different from you. Love that says, I see you as a person. Love that says, let your unique light shine in the world because each of our souls touches the divine mystery. Love that says, we're on a journey together and my fate is tied up with yours. Love that grabs you and won't let go until your whole life is dedicated to siding with love. Love that changes the world. Love is hard. Do it anyway. Take a moment and rest in the difficulties of love. Well, again, good morning. It is so great to be with you virtually. It seems like forever since we got to share the same space. And I know it's difficult. It's difficult even to keep up the energy to keep meeting like this. It takes so much more energy to actually create the service. As you gather here, please show love and appreciation for the whole team. They're doing an incredible job at pulling all these clips together and technically figuring it all out as we go. So I want to thank everyone who's been involved in putting these services on. So I've been thinking a lot about my own spiritual journey over the past few decades, or about your spiritual journey, because I sense most of us arrived here because we've made quite a migration. We've had quite a change in the things that we believed. And if I were to title my spiritual journey, it would be a prayer: God, help me get my shit together. I can think of few better sort of prayers. As a 25-year pastor, I spent decades trying to convince other people that I was absolutely certain of everything in matters of faith while not being sure of much of anything. When I really, brought myself to those quiet moments away from platforms and pulpits and social media, often I realized I lived with a persistent voice that said, you don't know what you're doing, right? You don't know what you're doing. And I used to be told that was the enemy. My sort of Christian story said that was the enemy trying to deceive me. That was a convenient defense mechanism, right, built into my Christian story. But now I realize that voice saying, you don't know what you're doing, right, wasn't the enemy. It was actually an honest friend helping keep me grounded enough to remember that you don't become an expert in God any more than you become an authority on the afterlife while you're still alive. And so little by little, I've tried to settle into a humility that can admit how much I don't know. As terrifying as that is personally and vocationally, and as often as it makes people uneasy, including myself, I'm trying to become more comfortable with the incomplete thoughts and the unresolved conflicts and the uncomfortable silences of trying to meet a maker who seems reclusive on some days and downright antagonistic on other days. I used to read C.S. Lewis, a Christian writer. You may be familiar with his writings, but he sort of describes the longing for the divine, the longing for meaning and for God, by saying that longing itself is confirmation that there is something there. right? He says we feel hunger because there's food to fill that. We thirst because we can actually drink and quench that. And so we question the existence of something greater, and that means that that something must be present. And whether you agree with that or not, I think that's a great place to start. That's where all authentic spiritual journeys begin, that gap between the need and the knowing. I think that gap between the need and the knowing, that's that messy, not yet space of wanting more information about the pressing questions of life than we have. And there's a dangerous arrogance to claiming any kind of moral authority or theological clarity other than saying, here's the best guess I can make based on the available information I have, though I could be wrong. And I love communities like ours because I think we are used to arguing with who we were yesterday. We're used to saying, I once believed this, but I'm not sure that I do. And I think arguing with who we were yesterday is really healthy. I think maybe that's what that prayer of asking for our daily bread really means. It means fuel and sustenance for this moment and enough to propel us into the coming day. And there's something about this journey that we're all on that we there's a grieving in the growing, right? There's a losing the old story. There's a losing of that security of the old story. There's a losing the identity that that story gave you, and then there's a losing of people from that story. And I've been thinking about you and me and what we've lost as we've gotten a new story about God or purpose or life or meaning, and the places where we used to be comfortable, the places where we used to feel welcome, the people who we used to call home. And I've had to be okay outgrowing organized religion and feeling that homelessness that comes when you do. And if I'm honest, many days, if I were to ask you, what do you believe at the bedrock of your spiritual journey or your moral striving, what do you believe? And sometimes it's difficult for me to know what I believe about God, how much of my childhood religion I can really firmly hold with my adult hands, like what kind of faith I can fully claim with conviction. I was lamenting this week about cruel Christians online, and someone said, well, what are you? I just said, I'm a mess. I don't know. But when I think about the journey of faith, there are fleeting moments for me when it all makes sense, or at least when I'm at peace with the senselessness, right? I don't need the dots to connect. I don't need to reconcile every discrepancy. I'm perfectly comfortable hovering in this disorganized spirituality. And I think about what I would call sacred experiences of my life. They're usually pretty short on tangible evidence. They're usually pretty difficult to quantify. I remember last year watching turtles hatching in the moonlight down at Carolina Beach. Or I can remember being in the middle of a U2 concert around 60,000 strangers singing, I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For. Or I think being downstairs with my daughter in the afternoon making meatballs together. Those are moments that I'm sure I don't know anything, but I feel something, and that something feels like whatever I think divinity should feel like when it enters the room. Divinity should yield safety and belonging and belovedness and rest and home. Now, you can have all those things without naming it God, but you can't have God and experience the absence of those things. In other words, a religion that is made of whatever God is made of, it can't leave people feeling less safe, less accepted, and less loved. And I would call that the fixed mathematics of the divine or of good religion. Its presence can't yield injury for other people, or the calculations are wrong. It can't perpetuate injustice or enable discrimination or manufacture pain, and it can't undermine people's humanity if it's made of whatever God is supposed to be made of. And yet, if we look at organized religion, especially right now in America, I think that's one of the greatest sources of grieving for me. As someone who grew up in that faith with that story, it's realizing that the anti-mask rage that we're seeing and the wild conspiracy theories and the resistance to the Black Lives Matter movement and the hostility towards immigrants and the celebration of the cruelty of this administration, it's coming from professed Christians. So the question I've been asking is, why are the most hateful people always the ones claiming faith in a God who is supposedly love? Now, I'm going to name drop because I'm pretty excited. I need to just adjust my screen here. I don't know how to do this technically, but I'm going to hold this up here. There's me, and there's Senator Kamala Harris. I was fortunate enough yesterday to be on a call with about 60 other faith leaders, ministers, spiritual writers from around the country, and she was talking about her hopes for America and her personal spirituality. And her childhood pastor was there. She was explaining what religion, faith means to her in the trenches of her life. But then she said, but if I'm honest, the past few years have really tested my faith. They've made me ask about the God that I always believed in, and I have to ask myself, what is God's plan in all of this? How do I understand God? And I think a lot of people, I think many of us here, we've had to wrestle with a God who is in danger of becoming a jerk by association. You know, we see what's happening in the country, and we see this predatory president, and we see people anointing him as associated with that God. And I think that the church, as we know it in America, is hemorrhaging by millions, not because people are immoral or obstinate or depraved. It's because they recognize that if benevolence is absent, then God is not present. Yesterday, a guy I never met before told me I was going to hell, and I usually breeze right by that, right? It's kind of white noise, but I was thinking about what you need to condemn someone to hell, right? Think about what you would need, because we may have been in a place where we thought we could do that. I remember growing up and being surrounded by people who were authorities on who was going to hell. But you need to check a lot of boxes. You need to believe in God, and you need to imagine you know that God's character intimately. You need to consent to that God manufacturing a place where that God would send someone for eternity. You need to know the requirements precisely for that sentence, and then you need to be sure that the person you're condemning meets those requirements, and to be fully convinced that you don't. And so I've come to the conclusion that anyone who can do that, they likely are misleading themselves, or they're just a jerk. And I'm grieving that, because I want a God of love. I want in my spiritual journey, whatever I find, to yield that truth. And I think that's what is so difficult about these days. I think there's a writer in the New Testament named Paul, and he says that faith is the substance of things unseen, the presence of things hoped for. And I think that spirituality is an aspirational orientation. It's a movement towards something that's just slightly out of reach. And my 51-year journey as a theological mutt, like many of you, I've been obedient Catholic altar boy, I've been disenchanted teen and hopeful agnostic and defiant atheist and overconfident megachurch pastor and deconstructing Christian and humanist, whoever I am now. The single conclusion I've come to as a result of all my study and my prayer and my wrestling and my preaching, the sole universal truth that I can hold on to is that faith should not make you a jerk, and that's all that I have. Your theology, your belief is valid to the degree that your life is loving. Beyond that, everything else is a waste of time to people. And if God exists, I think it's a waste of time to God too. If God is actually love, then there's no acceptable alternative. And I think the biggest disconnect for people who've lost or thrown away their religion, or at best misplaced it, is they can't reconcile hateful people peddling a God of love. They will not abide in tolerance, no matter who the person bringing it is, no matter what God they're passing the buck to. I think people are exhausted by hatred. They're tired of their neighbors not giving them any evidence of the golden rule. I think they're exhausted by people claiming a Jesus that they don't recognize, or a God who is cruel. I was talking with a friend last night, and she just had a conversation with her 5-year-old daughter named Billy. And this is the conversation they had. Billy is 5, and she said, "I figured it out." And her mother said, "Figured out what, Billy?" And Billy said, "God." And she said, "Oh, good. What's the answer?" And Billy said, "God is us. You and me and everyone inside us. That's God. When you give someone love, you're giving them God. And when they pray to God, they're praying for love." She's 5. I think she figured it out. So I wanted to share that today and get your thoughts on perhaps your spiritual journey, how it's changed, the idea of God being love, and why people who profess faith in that God tend to lack it so greatly. And then how do we live an apologetic of love? How do we live a practical theology of loving neighbor as I love myself? So tell me what you're thinking. What's going on? What are you wrestling with? What did you hear?
Hi.
The one thing I was thinking about when you mentioned someone said you're going to hell is, my thought was that person's probably in hell, and that's why he wants others to be going to hell, because he needs company. So anyway, that was what was occurring to me, is some of these people are actually living in hell.
That's an interesting idea. It's the idea that whatever I'm experiencing, I want people to experience. So if I'm joyful, I want other people to be joyful. If I'm feeling guilt, I somehow want other people to share in that guilt. And I think that's so true in what we're seeing, that there are people who are really trapped in a spirituality that is toxic to them. And it's that misery loves company. It's just such a strong thing. And I think that's what appeals to me about our community and about the movement I see of people who are like us, is that we're trying to say, there's actually a better way. There's actually a way that you can experience this longing and these questions without feeling like there is someone who is out to squash you. Because when you lose that, it's just so freeing. And that's a great thought. Who else?
So I'm Elizabeth, and when I attended the Unitarian Church in Gainesville, Florida, the minister was Jack Donovan. And he said something I've always remembered. He said, being holy is being happy and giving happiness to other people. And I've always liked that. It's very uplifting to me.
It is. For me, it's been difficult. I talked about sort of the old stories, and when we lose those, when we grieve those, and people asking me, well, what are you? And it's hard to quantify. But for me, the very best things about my upbringing, about the message of Jesus, was the way that Jesus left people with more humanity and not less. And that's the thing that you come to realize, that there are so many people who have so been given a distorted story that they wouldn't recognize that presence if it showed up, that benevolent presence, that forgiving presence, that humility. And so it's something that I think is really a strong source of grief for me and many, that I just want people to experience something that does no harm. And that's what spirituality, whatever it is, should offer people for sure.
Okay.